Mr. Norman Mailer was born in New Jersey and was graduated from Harvard in 1943, at which point he went to Southeast Asia to fight a war he approved of, one of the last ever. He returned to write The Naked and the Dead and to begin his ascent, as he put it, to the presidency, by which he means to his acceptance as the top American writer alive. He has recently published a book called The Armies of the Night, which is the story of the campaign he and Robert Lowell and Dwight MacDonald waged upon the Pentagon won, which has been greatly acclaimed. It is safe to say that men of better critical judgment than Mr. Mailer now regard him as the best writer in America. His technique is one of unalloyed narcissism, mitigated by a recognition of, not to say a devotion to, his own shortcomings. One unappreciative reviewer, a couple of books back, summarized, quotes, "We are assured that our hero fought one of his brawls after getting 2 hammer blows on the head, that he put Kennedy in office and could put Patterson back on his throne, that he out-debated Buckley, that he outwrites everybody since Hemingway and outloves everybody since Casanova. In short, that he can lick anybody in the house. It is a boast he should be able to make with some confidence. After these tirades, there cannot be many left in the house, and they deserve their licking." We are here to talk about Mr. Mailer's book and about Mr. Mailer, and, if possible, not about the war in Vietnam. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Mailer to disclose whether he believes that artists should be immune from the harassments of the law.
Before we do that, I'd like to correct one thing in your charming introductory remarks. And as I never claimed I was the greatest lover in the world.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
So, once again, you were making your case too fine. No, I don't think artists should be...
only since Casanova, though.
I don't even claim that. I don't think artists should be let off anything. Quite the contrary. Whatever gave you that idea?
Well, what gave me the idea was that you were sentenced for 5 days in jail, and as I understand it, you were appealing on the grounds that it was that you were sentenced because you were very famous, and that therefore this was a discriminating act. Now, do I therefore understand that only people who are not very famous should be sentenced when they break the law?
Well, that's not my impression of it. Actually, when I got the sentence, I wanted to get out that day, just for reasons that were quite private and personal. When you're in jail, when you think you're going to be in jail for a day, it's mildly disagreeable to be in jail for 5 days. It's just a mildly disagreeable matter. There's no great injustice going on. And I could have stayed in jail for 5 days. I think looking back on now, I wanted to get out in one day because I had a feeling there was a book in me, and 5 days in jail could take the edge off that book. I wanted to get back and I wanted to see my family. I thought if I could get out on bail in one day, I'd come back and serve the 3 or 4 days. At that point, the lawyer said, well, you know, it'll cost about $1,000 to appeal it. I said, well, good Lord, then I'm not going to appeal it. I'm going to go in and serve the 3 days or 4 days that remain of my sentence, because that's certainly, I think that's cheaper than $1,000, you know. And then they said later, well, no, we're going to appeal them all in a group. And so far as I know, my case is one of 25 or 30. Now, if they've used that language, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's perfectly pleasant lawyer talk. It's nothing to do with me. I think you know that you don't keep up with every last detail of your life because there are things written about you by friends or associates of yours that sometimes give you pause. If I had been consulted, I would have said, no, don't word it that way. It's not the proper way to word it.
So you wouldn't...
Although I think there's no doubt that I was given the largest sentence because I was well known. The judge said so. He said he was making a point of me because I was well known.
But on the other hand, you went down to Washington because you were well known, as your book makes clear, right?
Oh, I'm not objecting. I mean, in other words, he wanted to give me a larger sentence because I'm well known. Fine. That's the judge's discretion. It's just that the lawyers may be thinking that, well, that's unfair. Yeah. If that's what they're appealing it on, fine. We've all made many jokes, my friends and I, about how this case is going to take 5 years and I'll get 4 days. You know? But I've not been. I don't think there's any miscarriage of justice going on.
Well, do you, as a general proposition, believe that when you break the law, you should go to jail?
Well, that's an enormously complex matter, and I want to get into it with you later. But on this one, I'd say, of course. You know, of course, in the limited sense that I was breaking I was consciously breaking the law on this matter, and so I expected to be sent to jail. I also expected, I must admit, that the sentence would be very slight. But if I'd known it was greater, I think I still would have, planned to get arrested, because I wished to protest the war in Vietnam. Incidentally, I don't know how we're going to talk about all these matters without mentioning the war in Vietnam from time to time.
Well, I don't mind particularly, except your agent told me that you very emphatically didn't want to talk about the war in Vietnam.
Well, I wanted to talk
I assume
about...
he was talking, or is he like your lawyer?
Well, I have many lawyers and many agents.
In other words, can we waive your agent?
It wasn't the agent, Bill. Once again, you're inaccurate. It was the publisher's representative.
I see. I should remember these distinctions, yeah.
Now, I wanted to talk about the Armies of the Night, which has a good bit to do about the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Actually, all I wanted was to keep us from getting into a general philosophical discussion, because I didn't see how we could do it in an hour, and I thought this would give us something to circle around. But also, with vast deference to your scholarship and your ability to misremember facts I never learned. I wanted to have something that I could have for a point of reference. That's why I wanted the book to be discussed.
Oh, sure. I'm very anxious to discuss your book.
Because I vaguely remember this.
I think everyone should read, because I think it's an extremely interesting and enjoyable book, if that's the right word for it.
Well, I wish someone on the right wing would write a book that would be as good, because it would be a great help to us on the left. I wanted to help the right wing to understand the left.
You wouldn't notice it.
No, I would notice it. I mean, I have a love of literature.
Yes.
I think even Wall's a marvelous writer.
Yeah. Yes,
unfortunately, he's not an American.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, he's dead.
That too.
Well, I do think that one gets a sense in reading your books that you develop your own forms of expiation, and that when you do something which is either ugly or preposterous, which is worse, at least by your standards, you sort of work it out of your system by writing ruthlessly about it. But it seems to me that part of the rules of your game, in which not everybody can play, is that these powers that you develop of self-exculpation are not necessarily those in which other people who don't belong to your own religion share. In other words, you can...
You mean the Jewish religion or my private religion?
No, obviously I didn't mean the Jewish religion, and you knew I didn't mean the Jewish religion.
I learned the art of diversion from William F. Buckley.
I mean that your notion is that you can go down there, get sloshed, say silly and abusive things, which Time magazine writes up rather accurately. So you get sore.
Witty
Time
things
magazine.
as well. They weren't just silly; they were also witty. Many of the remarks were quite witty. I saw a movie of that evening. Mm-hmm. Some of the stuff was pretty funny. I was surprised. Yes. I was even better than I thought.
That's right. That's sure. And I don't doubt that one can be funny even while being all those other things, right?
Drunk.
Yeah, drunk.
Certainly, you've seen people who've been funny and drunk.
Oh, sure. In fact, some people have to become drunk in order to be funny.
Funny, drunk, and abusive. I first fell in love with the Irish because they had this great gift of being funny, drunk, and abusive all at once.
It wasn't their religion that did it?
It bore a deep relation to their religion. It may be fond in a tangential way of Catholicism, which is why I went to Notre Dame recently.
Which is why what?
Which is why I went to Notre Dame recently to have a premiere of my movie, the world premiere.
Yes, because you were fond of the
Fond of the Irish, yes.
Yeah. Well,
I'm a racist.
The point I think is worth pressing because a lot of people, as you know, spend many hours agonizing as postulants of your religion, and I do think that one of your forms is, as I say, this ruthless self which in itself is very interesting. Of course, we've seen it before, haven't we? St. Augustine and other of your predecessors.
My literary letters.
A point that no doubt was raised in Notre Dame.
Yeah.
But my point is that at the end, you forgive yourself as a generous man.
Full of compassion.
That's right, yeah, as a compassionate man. But this doesn't necessarily happen to all the people who read you, I suppose. They tend to consider as mitigating the fact that your muse has been stimulated into staccanovite activity every time you get into a jam. But this doesn't necessarily mean that you were right in what you did. Isn't that correct? But doesn't your book, in effect, contend to this?
No, what I was trying to do in the book, if I can say what I was trying to do,
Sure.
because I listened with enormous interest to everything you were saying, because it was as Greek to me. Really, I didn't see the book that way. I didn't see it as a tremendous confession. I thought it was rather a superficial presentation of myself and my attitudes.
Why superficial? Why
Well, I
didn't you-
didn't go deeply into, I mean, I could write another book below this book, if you will, which would be 3 times as long and happily 10 times as deep. This book, because I was writing about myself in the third person, I felt there was a comic vein that could not be ignored, which I liked and enjoyed. In fact, I think there's nothing more health restoring than to write about yourself in the third person for a period of 9 weeks and 90,000 words. It gives you an incredible detachment about yourself and a sort of tolerance and good humor, not only about your foibles but about your virtues, which is very important. Because, we all tend to have a certain charity for our foibles, but we always, if we're not careful, we get too serious about our virtues. When suddenly we see the virtues in relation to the foibles, and we take a certain detachment from ourselves, things get a little less irritating, a little less maddening, a little less, over-passionate. But what I would like to get back to really is that what I intended in the book was to show that there's that for years there's been this newspaper legend that had grown up about me, which was overblown and anomalous, and finally it was ridiculous. It had me as some sort of a savage, barbaric version of Hemingway. And in fact, I'm half the man's size, and physically, and probably in literary ways as well. And I just felt that it's part of the madness of America. For years I felt that the greatest trouble with this country is that it's insane. Not the people, but the social mechanisms in the country are insane. Oddly enough, we'd agree on half the social mechanisms that are insane and part company altogether on the others. But one of the things I felt, one of the tiny things that I felt it was certainly insane about was me. Now, everyone has the idea, because I write about myself all the time, I think I'm enormously important. I don't, but it's the one thing I really do know something about. It's the one thing I claim to be an expert on, is myself and my own intellectual adventures. And
Inter alia.
in fact, I'm even on record as claiming that I'm an intellectual adventurer. Because for me, the interest in an idea is not necessarily in verifying its certainty, because one rarely can. It's in getting an intimation of whether it's a well-placed or nicely proportioned idea by the way you feel it as it passes through you. Or as an existential approach to the intellectual life. So I wrote this book not to exculpate myself, but to show that Time magazine finally was a little mad. They were part of the madness. That the newspaper coverage of this event was part of the madness because it didn't enter it. You see, it condemned from without, which is, by the way, the absolute mark of the psychotic. I worked in a mental hospital years ago when I was in college for a summer, actually for a week because I couldn't take it for too long. And one of the things about all psychotics in this mental hospital, or almost all of them, was that they all condemned. They had an extraordinary power to condemn. It was absolutely unbelievable. They had very little perception of what was going on, but so far as they could perceive anything, they immediately condemned it.
Well, are we talking about psychotics and or Time magazine?
If you notice, I lumped them together, yes.
Yeah. Well, now, I think it would be interesting, since you yourself selected that as a point of departure, to understand your book and your entire experience, perhaps by considering the rendition of it that was reported in Time magazine, which struck me even after reading your book as perfectly accurate.
Well, it was perfectly accurate in a superficial way. I chose that not because it was we all know you could take an example of Time reporting that would be incredibly inaccurate. I took this because superficially it was quite accurate. If you insist upon looking at everything I do in my book on a superficial basis, then you'll find the Time magazine version is accurate. But what I was interested in is that the real quality of an experience is never captured by not only Time, but by everything Time stands for. In other words, that kind of journalism, which appropriates experience rather than entering it. You see, there's a
Excuse me a second. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's back up a moment. In fact, as you recognize in the book, you were very drunk, right, when you were addressing this protest audience.
Well, no, not very drunk. Very drunk. First of all, Time said I was staggering. They were wrong on that. I wasn't staggering. The proof that I wasn't staggering, I wasn't that drunk, is that after the meeting was over, I got down off the stage, walked around, talked to people, went to a party where I continued to drink for hours, and so home.
Well, that's not exactly proof.
Well,
really,
it's
because-
true. Generally when a man's staggering, he's a remarkable fellow if he continues to stagger for the next 5 or 6 hours.
But you are a
You've got to be an
remarkable
Irishman
fellow,
to stagger for 5 or 6 hours.
Well, I think that's a valid judgment, maybe. But Time Magazine's point, I think, was that that you moved into the situation, took advantage of it, perhaps because you were nervous, as indeed you were,
Well,
self-conscious, as indeed you were. I'm quoting you, not Time, at this particular moment. And that
Well, I
under
wasn't nervous.
circumstances, it was a pretty conspicuous Mailer performance. I mean, the kind of thing that people talk about for years to come.
I think in all these years I've probably had about 3 or 4 occasions when I have had a lot to drink and talked in public, and maybe more.
Well, that's why I
Maybe
say highly conspicuous.
a highly conspicuous Mailer performance. When you say a Mailer performance, it assumes it's the sort of thing that goes on once a week.
No. I say highly conspicuous. Yeah, assuming that you were drunk every time you talked, it wouldn't have been highly conspicuous. Any more than would have been highly conspicuous if Joey Lewis, let's say,
Well, the
gave
sense
a
I
very
got,
wet performance.
the sense I got from your 4 words was that it was a typical Mailer performance.
Well,
You see, now maybe I
You should
misinterpreted.
study
Maybe I was
the
unfair
inflections
to
of the
you.
language.
I was listening to the nuances of your voice.
Well, what Time Magazine, after all, said was after more obscenities, Mailer introduced poet Robert Lowell, who got annoyed at requests to speak louder. I'll bellow, but it won't do any good, he said, and proceeded to read from Lord Weary's Castle. By the time the action shifted to the Pentagon, Mailer was perky enough to get himself arrested by 2 marshals. Quotes, I transgressed a police line, he explained with some pride, on the way to the lockup, where the toilet facilities are scarce indeed, and the coffee mugs are low octane.
Isn't that pure time? Where the toilet facilities are scarce.
That's
indeed.
pretty good, don't you think?
It's good for time.
After
yeah.
all, you were talking about micturation in your book. I never thought I'd hear
Well,
you
that's-
utter a word with that many syllables.
That's it's the influence. It's because of our close and continuing correspondence. That's another example of Time Magazine at work, though. They earlier in this they talk of my engaging in a scatological solo. An extraordinarily ambiguous remark. I mean, what was I doing? Was I acting like a monkey, throwing gobbets? That's what you get from the idea of a scatological solo. Whereas actually, the confession I made that night was about micturation, wasn't it? See, now there's a physical, spiritual, and probably a philosophical difference between scatological matters and acts of micturation.
Well, I can see that you're a student of the subject, but
Well, I'm glad you can keep up with me.
No, I didn't say I could. I said I can see that you're a student of the subject. Let's try to refocus the discussion. Mine is that Time Magazine observed a lot of people waiting to hear some lectures that you weren't, to use your own word, staggering. Or was that their word?
Their word was that I was
Their
staggering.
word.
My word, and I give it to you in confidence, was that I was not.
Okay, that you're not. Okay. But
I was bobbing and weaving, but I always do that in public. I mean, I'm doing it right now,
Yeah. But you...
Who knows where the next question is coming from,
Yeah. But what I think really that it's worthwhile, rather than to ask, just how sober were you, to ask why was the fact of your drinking and the fact of your behaving noticeably, which resulted in news stories in Time Magazine and lots of whisperings around the country. Why is that a part of the experience as it relates to the moral of this book? Because the book does have a moral, doesn't it?
Well, I could answer that. I could answer you for 5 minutes. Let me try to take 2. To begin with, one of the reasons, let's say one of the conscious, purposeful reasons I was out there drinking, anytime a man gets drunk, he can't state to a certainty that he got drunk for a political reason, or a philosophical reason, or a spiritual reason. He may have gotten drunk because he had to get drunk because he was upset about something.
Yeah.
You see, there's always that doubt implicit in it. So I'm going to say that so far as I know my reasons for getting drunk that night, and so far as they had a point, one of the points is that I've always found the left to be as stuffy as the right. In other words, the extreme left is about as boring as the extreme right. And I think both suffer terribly from this. And I just wanted to show them that there's a certain sort of, there's a cult of propriety about speaking in public. And this cult insists that the speaker always be completely sober, whereas we know for a fact that most speakers, when they get up to speak, particularly at banquets and so forth, they're often dead drunk. It's just they've found a way of doing it where they become...
You sound like Time Magazine. They're not dead drunk, they couldn't speak.
Right, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you've learned the fine point that I made earlier.
I learned fast.
Yes, you do. You really do discriminate. The notion I wanted just to get across was that these people get up there, I mean, any number of famous poets, authors, politicians, and so forth, who really go maundering after a little spit, if I may quote myself for a phrase. They're up there and they're desperate to think of the next phrase because they're sodden with liquor. But they take a sensen before they go on. And they sip a lot of water, and they speak slowly, and they say nothing, and they're dully applauded, and they go home. They don't create a disturbance.
Why are they asked back? Why are they asked back?
Because they have a name, because people forget, and because they're not trouble, which is also important. I mean, sometimes you're asked back because you're trouble, and sometimes you're asked back because you're not trouble. Depends on the little institution that's inviting you. At any rate, I just wanted to get up there and just show them, man could be drunk and make no pretensions about it and have a marvelous time. There's also a literary tradition about a literary figure, so-called or legitimate, getting up in public, drunk, and having a good time. Some of the brightest things ever said are said when you're drunk because the devil is with you then. You know that as a good Catholic. And Brenton Behan, for instance, I mean, the poor man drank himself to death, but he was fabulous in public upon occasion when he was drunk, better than when he was sober. So I thought I was working within a good, firm tradition, and I wanted to start on the left. I wanted to get the troops fired up. I wanted to give them a few laughs, and I also wanted to say a great many things. I also was appalled, you see, by the general air of the occasion. There was a pall that hung over the left because they were in terror before this thing. It was an extraordinary move. People on the left are more law-abiding than anybody else. That's why they're on the left. They have...
Explain that, would you?
I'd be happy to. It's exactly because their lives are so middle class and full of propriety that their political ideas become more and more powerful. I mean, you very rarely find a leftist who's the kind of guy who goes out in the bar and gets drunk every night and gets a couple of bar brawls. They're always somewhere comfortably between the center and the right. I mean, 9 out of 10. I know that much of your support when you ran for mayor came from fellows like that because I used to run into them often. Mayor, what do you got against Buckley?
Yeah. Well, that was just proper enthusiasm, or something.
I never resented it. I said if I didn't have an idea in my head, I'd be for it myself. I used to say that.
You always find just the right word. Your point is that the political left takes its politics so seriously that it understands the necessity for abiding by the law?
No, sir.
No?
No. No, I was talking about emotional matters. I was saying that the left generally... There's an old joke on the left that... which is, are the dentists yet on the barricades? There's something about a proper life that tends to make one a little more radical in one's opinions, and I've always felt this has been the disease of the left. You see, just as the disease of the right is greed, bigotry, insensitivity, and general stupidity, so the disease of the left, yourself excluded, sir, I assure you that. So the disease of the left has always been excessive propriety in family life, excessive obedience to all the small laws of daily life, such as you're only crossing at the corners. You'll find that many more communists and Trotskyists and people like that will cross at the corner, you see, than Minutemen or FBI men,
Well, that's because they want to save themselves as lawbreakers for major occasions, isn't it?
Well, they may say that to themselves, but I think the real reason is that they think of overturning society because they do not know how to break a few small rules and laws. Now, I, as an existential leftist, as a left conservative, often felt that what the left needed was a great deal of waking up. Now, of course, I always consider myself ridiculous because I'm always seeing myself as either larger or smaller than I am. And on this occasion, I saw myself as larger than I am. And so I thought that I could do it, that I could engage in some sort of Herculean activity, you see, lift this entire left movement up on my shoulders. Absolute madness, narcissism, if you will. Of course, what happens is that when you go in for such extraordinary narcissism, it's like a great house cleaning, a spiritual house cleaning. The next day I was full of contrition. I felt very modest. I suddenly realized these were terribly serious matters, and that finally a man could not only go to jail for a couple of days, but if the country kept going the way it was going, if the war in Vietnam continued, that I, this great lifter of the left, was finally probably going to end up just a mean little convict like any other, having to be in jail for a year or 2 or 5, because finally I realized I'd become so opposed to this war that I was ready, on a full hangover even, to go to jail as a protest against this war. That was very chastening. Those were the first 2 days of the... I remember I said it would take a few minutes to do this. Those are the first 2 days of the...
Before you go on, though, I would like to ask you this. You say that you had been ready to go to jail for a couple of days. But,
No, I'm not making myself
for 4 or
clear.
5 days or whatever.
Oh, yes, yes.
Because of the opposition to the war. But is there a point at which you would have considered that you would not have been prepared to disobey the law? That is to say, if the penalty was
Life imprisonment.
inordinate. Yeah. Excuse me.
Well, I think
1
obviously.
second, hold on,
yeah.
excuse me. I'm interested in the answer to that question because people are groping for means of causing people to abide by the law. And some people, myself for instance, are about ready to believe that some of the punishments for breaking the law are probably too trivial. So is there a certain point at which you would have been deterred? For instance, Dwight MacDonald made it very clear on this program a while ago that he really didn't want to go to jail.
Oh, I don't either. Who wants to go to jail?
Well, some people would love it.
Well, a few
I'm sure
do.
that
A
Eamon
few do.
Hennessy
A few do.
never happy outside of
But I
jail.
can't say that I'm one of them, no.
Yeah,
No, I'm too much of a pleasure lover to even dream of enjoying jail.
yeah.
But in answer to your question, let's say if the penalty had been life imprisonment,
To take an extreme.
would I have done it? No, but you know what I would have done? I would have been forced to go underground, you see, or leave the country, or turn into an enemy of the country.
Well, aren't
which
you,
is-
in one sense, an enemy of the country?
No, sir, not yet. Not yet.
Not, what do you mean, not yet?
Well, I mean, I still believe that this country is a marvelous country, and that one fights within this country. If one's completely wiped off the board, in other words, if you really have no way to fight for your ideas any longer in this country, then you have to decide one of two things, which is either one, your ideas are wrong, or two, the country is wrong.
Correct. But we have, for instance, Mr. Gore Vidal, who says that unless we elect an anti-Vietnam War president in November of 1968, he will renounce his citizenship. His reasoning is that if, in fact, the American people ratify a war that he considers so detestable, then he will become finally convinced that the American people are not worth associating with. On the contrary, that you must dissociate with them. You don't share that opinion?
Well, I don't, because for one thing, I don't think that the vote is a pure expression of the people at any given time anyway. The vote is much too crude an instrument to measure what real feelings are in the country. Moreover, politics is extraordinarily complex and dialectical and contradictory. For example, Nixon could get in and get in on a pro-war policy and be the man to make the peace, precisely because he's a Republican, and that's long been a theory of mine, that it's the Democrats who start the wars and the Republicans who finish them. Mainly because the Democrats always have to prove that they're not communists, so they always have to be very militant against the communists. The Republicans don't have to prove that, so they can make peace with the communists. But if you look at the last few wars, that's how they've gone.
You regret that?
No, I think it's part of the pleasurable comedy of politics, you see. But, I don't take politicians seriously except as adventurers. I think they're splendid fellows as adventurers, and I admire many of their qualities. I admire their ability to move from idea to idea and bed to bed. That they're exceptional.
Well, you say that the Democrats are always feeling the necessity to prove that they're not communists, but are you glad that they're not communists?
Am I glad they're not communists?
Yeah.
I detest communism. I detest it much more than you do because I know much more about it. I mean, I've read, for instance, I read Marx. You know, studied him. I spent 3 months studying him. I love Marx, you see. I just detest communism because it betrayed Marx. This is the way you might detest some awful Christian sect that had completely betrayed Christ, you know.
Yeah. I certainly understand what you're talking about, but it is, of course, true that the typical communist who lives, let's say, on the other side of the Iron Curtain would be much less frightened by a Mailer administration than, say, by a Buckley administration.
No, I think
so
they
at
can
least
comprehend.
as far as they are concerned, I think they would probably consider the people I support as more relevantly anti-communist than people you support. The last time you were heard of on the political ramparts was on a committee on being friends for Castro, for a fair play for Castro committee, or
I'm still, I still am all for Castro. I think he's a remarkable man. Let me just say that I think that the communists would probably, well, I can't pretend they would ever be least bit happy with you. They would feel a certain security, which is they would feel that they would have some idea of what you might be about to do next. They couldn't ever feel that with me. I love the way we're treating each other as world leaders. You see, I'm not the only narcissist in the house.
No, you always told me to respect your metaphors, which I'm just doing.
And, I'm glad that we're beginning to find some conjunction of discourse. That I'm beginning to, well, let it go at that. But no, for instance, I like to keep a certain freedom, a certain liberty to look at the lineaments of major figures. For instance, just until the strike started in France, as of a week ago, I was saying I thought the two greatest political figures in the world today were Fidel Castro and Charles de Gaulle. Now, I think I may still be able to say that a week from now, because so far I think de Gaulle's been acting sort of I think he's the world's greatest living conservative. You know, I think he's a remarkable man. I'm tremendously fond of him. I have great respect for him. I have great respect for Castro. The point is that men's, you know, this is the way one can have a great respect for saints and generals, for criminals and cops. You know, such a thing as a great cop and such a thing as a great criminal. And the way I work, it's very hard to explain this to people, but I don't think in categories. I think rather, I try to think in this way, that the world is better off if every so-called type in the world is better. In other words, it's a better world when the cops get better and the criminals get better. It's a poorer world when the cops are dull and the criminals are dull. In other words, as an existentialist, what I believe is what really is important at a moment is how much life there is, how much psychic life, how much spiritual life, how much physical life.
Yeah, but I think we better stop and rescue that from banality.
Please do, because I can't see what the banality is, and you want this old horse to walk over the cliff.
What it is that decides what makes, for instance, a good criminal class. For instance, we don't...
imagination, vitality,
brilliance.
Instance,
we might say that Hitler showed extraordinary imagination when you consider the scale in which he undertook genocide.
He was absolutely untrue to his own ideas. He betrayed his own ideas and led the world
this is to introduce another element. Presumably the ideas of the criminal, whether the criminal is a mass murderer or an arson or a thief, is to perfect his craft. Well, so if you're asking for better criminal, I think you better make it clear what it is.
Let me say that I obviously am not going to carry this to every ridiculous extreme. A mass murderer. Well, a mass murderer is not necessarily a criminal. You know, one of the best remarks that Marx ever made, and I do recommend them for your reading, or maybe this was Engels, in fact, is that...
You asking me?
Oh, no, sir, no. If you know the answer, though, I'll be in your service. Is that quantity changes quality. Mm-hmm. You see, a man who kills one man may be moral or immoral. We can't know. We have to know intimately what happened. Generally, the assumption is that he was immoral, grievously immoral. At the very least, we know that he has changed his life so profoundly, and that he is now so much, if you believe in an immortal soul, as I do, which you can gain or lose, that he has so endangered his soul that we cannot look upon his condition as a light one, you know, and I would not presume to judge him too quickly. A man who murders 4 or 5 people is already a man of an altogether different sort. A man who murders millions is a man who defies our conception of what it is to be a man. And so for that reason, I would be perfectly willing to let my hypothesis dwindle and die long before we get to the man who kills 3 or 4 people. You see, we have to be allowed a little wit when we speak of these matters. You know.
How long is long before you kill 3 or 4 people?
One. Once a philosopher, twice a pervert. That's the key to keep in mind.
Yeah. I don't promise to keep it in mind. I promise to keep in mind that you keep it in mind.
Well, actually, it's not mine. It's Voltaire's.
Yeah. Well, your notion then that the improvement of people in categories is something which you as an artist desire, and you do not or do relate this to your position as a leftist.
Well, to be honest, I'm a left conservative, you know, and since that's an odd category to say the least, I don't think of myself as a leftist anymore. I think of myself as a left conservative. You know, there are places where trees are quite as important as people. There are places where you have to draw the line. We have to say, well, maybe it may even be better that a few people go hungry, you see, than that everyone have banal food. You know, which is after all part of the problem, I think, of the modern temper, which is, you know, how do we solve all this? And
therefore it makes no difference to you, as far as I can understand, what is the effect of an individual's regime on the people that he rules, so much as it makes a difference what is the style by which he rules. For instance, we know that the flight from Cuba is on the scale of the flight from Hitler, larger, as a matter of fact, as a matter of percentage of the national population. We know that conventional and unconventional freedoms don't exist, including certain freedoms that you profess yourself, I'm sure convincingly, as attached to. And yet you admire Castro. What is it about Castro that you find so admirable? And how is it that you permit him to defy your twice a pervert rule, since he's killed twice times 1,000 people?
Oh, well, look, all government leaders kill people. I mean, you know, that you take for granted.
Not all.
Bill, excuse me, Mr. Buckley, we cannot mix these categories. Yeah. If we're talking about murderers, you know, I say I draw the line at one, once philosopher, twice pervert. You don't talk about governments. governments kill one way or another. They kill in all sorts of ways. I mean, we can talk about how people get killed in America. Now, we might part company on it. You might say that they die because they get into automobile accidents. Ralph Nader might say they die because there's been a systematic lack of effort to design cars properly to protect the people who drive them. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
I could say that people die in New York City at an incredible rate of lung cancer because the air in the city is no longer fit to breathe. You might say, well, that's part of the 20th century. I might say it's part of the greed and blindness of the American capitalist system.
Yeah, but I think that there's an obvious distinction here that if it escapes you or oughtn't to, which is that one has to distinguish between the quality of the act of somebody who kills somebody in an effort to insist that a society oblige his views of how it ought to proceed, and somebody who simply killed, in a sense, accidentally, as a result of how that particular society evolutionized. I don't think, for instance, that Henry Ford, the discoverer of the automobile, should go down in anybody's history book as the greatest mass murderer of the century, even though more people have been killed by automobiles probably than by almost any other means short of war. This is surely elementary, but not so much so that you...
But I'm not... You're extending my point to a place where it becomes absurd, which is not quite the same thing as my point, which is over here. You know, not all remarks can be extrapolated out to infinity. In fact, most remarks fall off the table at a certain point.
That's the mark of the fanatic, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, anyone who would make that remark about Ford would be a fanatic.
Yeah.
I'm not a fanatic. In fact, I'm trying to extirpate fanaticism in conversation wherever I find it.
Well, you keep curious company under the circumstances.
You mean with Castro? Let's get
well,
back to Castro.
Certainly with Castro, but also with some of the gang who go around saying that Lyndon Johnson is the greatest mass murderer of the age and all that kind of business.
Well, I'll tell you what I will say about Lyndon Johnson. I'll tell you what I will say about Lyndon Johnson, which is that given this country, given this sort of fine, marvelous country with its extraordinarily agreeable, genial life, you know, in so many ways, with the easiness of life in America, with the prosperity of life in America, the fact that we go around burning children in Asia makes him, in my mind, a murderer of such ominous and abominable propensities that while I would not wish to say he was superior to Hitler in that category, he is a shocking man. That I would say.
Yeah, well, I think it's a pretty shocking thing for you to say under the circumstances. To begin with, incredibly
You mean being your guest
vulgar, to say that we go around burning children in Vietnam. There's a sense in which everyone, I think, ought to be mature enough to recognize that one of the things that makes war despicable is that war is despicable. And if we could have very pleasant wars in which women and children and men over 29 and under 19 were never hurt, and that all deaths should be neat and punctilious, then we might be able to speak about wars in other senses. But the very fact that children get burned in a war is simply an acknowledgement of the fact that children exist. It's an acknowledgement of nothing else than that.
Well,
and if you're trying to insinuate, then I think you should be apologetic for having done so, that Lyndon Johnson attempts to burn children because this is how he satisfies his perversity.
May I answer that?
Then you need to write another book of
I need a
explanation.
couple of minutes to answer that.
Yeah.
Just a couple of minutes. The thought that occurs first to me is that there is a way to have the kind of war you talk about, a clean war. War, by now, I believe, is fought for image. In other words, short of a nuclear war, in which there would be a real exchange of power, to which one country would finally end up physically dominant over another country, the sort of wars that go on now are really wars which, in effect, state, keep your peace. We are stronger than you. Do not move in on us. Do not invade. Do not attack. If we could just adopt a little convention to recognize that ground wars by now and air wars, which are short of nuclear wars, are fought for image, we could buy a tract of land in the Amazon.
Why do you call it image? For instance, when Israel tries to rebuff the Arabs, do you call it image that
was
they
a different war.
designed?
That was an altogether different war. Are we going to talk about all wars?
All wars are different except those that you say are the same.
No. I don't. I'm perfectly.
First, you start out by saying all wars nowadays are fought for image except nuclear wars. So I brought up the Israeli war. Now you say except it. Are you going to wrench everything as inapplicable to your generality?
I said all our wars. All right, I was imprecise. I'll give you that. All our wars are fought for image. All our wars with communism are fought for image. We obviously can't have a war with communism which is going to dominate communism. We're not capable of defeating the communists anymore, and the communists are not capable of defeating us any longer in a ground-air war. It would have to be a nuclear war for one side to win, then obviously, or so it seems, there'd be very little left. Let's go on and finish one point at a time. I don't want to leave all these points left behind, like Castro, Israel, what have you. I have a perfect right to separate wars, to speak of one war as being a good war and another war not being a good war. Because if you don't do that, then you have to argue that all wars are good or all wars are bad.
Yeah.
And to test the point of view that says all wars are bad, because then you end up with a sort of with nothing but vegetarians and pacifists. And I think that life is more active than that. And I think that, for instance, I believe, and this is the conservative side of my politics, that a young man who is willing to die for his country is not an ignoble or ridiculous young fellow. I think it's tragic when he's asked to die in a war, which is absurd. Now, you may then say, well, who am I to decide that war in Vietnam is absurd? Well, then we have the argument on that ground, whether that's an absurd war or not.
Which is certainly a ground that I don't funk.
No, you have your opinions on it and I have mine,
Yeah.
and if you want to, we can get into that. But what I'm getting at is I don't want to be boxed into a corner where I'm going in through, trying to sweep the food off the table through logical niceties. How's that for a mixed metaphor?
Pretty bad. Yeah. You were saying, Mr. Mailer.
But I wanted to get back on some of the points that we bypassed
Yeah.
while we were talking quickly. One of them is my feelings about Castro.
Yeah.
To begin with, one of the reasons why the rate of people, not the absolute number, but the rate of people who left Cuba have been greater than those who left Nazi Germany, which I take from you as being factual. It may not be. But if it is, there are a number of reasons for it. One of them is that Castro let them out. He did not keep them from going out. He allowed them to leave. He didn't always allow them to leave, but there was a period where he let
Well,
them
that's
leave.
historically inaccurate.
he
Hitler
said-
allowed anybody to leave, but he wouldn't allow people to leave with their property. Castro has not allowed anybody to leave with his property and has been extremely erratic in the flow of people that he allows out. For instance, he makes them go to Madrid, which means that anybody who leaves has to be capitalized to the tune of about $800 for a ticket to Madrid on over to North America, which is a form of torture that I don't think you particularly admire.
It's not agreeable. No, I would not admire that. And in fact, if I were ever to talk to him, I would talk to him and say, why do you
Cut
do
it
that?
out, yeah.
I
Why
wouldn't say
don't you-
cut it out. I'd say, why do you do that?
Yeah, what would he say?
I'd be interested in his reply. It might be different than yours.
I hope so.
But at any rate, the reason I admire him is because the man has a heroic quality. Because I believe that Cuba under Batista was far worse than it is today. I think it was an ugly, obscene, disgusting place. I think today I have a hunch that there are any number of aspects of Cuba that I would detest. I think there'd probably be a fanaticism and a militancy that I wouldn't
this
like.
is very fashionable. I hear this said very, very often, and I think it is thoughtlessly said. For instance, I hope you remember that the National Review loathed Batista. But under Batista at his worst, there were certain things that you could do. For instance, you could found an opposition newspaper. For instance, you could publish your book. For instance, you could join a labor union. For instance, you could strike. For instance, you could travel in and out of the country. For instance, you could practice your religion freely. Now, it seems to me that here is a list of 6 things which, even up against the personal vulgarity of Batista, made life in Cuba a hell of a lot preferable under him than under his successor.
Well, it certainly did for the middle classes in Cuba up to
Oh,
a
well, how
point.
about poor people, too? Poor people read books.
Well, no, but there was a very low literacy rate in Cuba. Castro's improved the literacy rate enormously.
Well, you see, enormously, yeah.
Well, I don't have the figures, so I won't say enormously. He certainly has improved it. You won't pretend he hasn't improved
No,
the
I
literacy rate.
don't pretend that. But for you to say that, after all, poor people don't really need freedom, whether economic or political.
I'm saying the opposite of that.
Well, you're saying that in effect. You say, well, these are middle-class values.
The poor people
What about joining a labor union? You're supposed to be for that, aren't you?
No, well, that's one point at a time. The poor people never had any freedom under Batista. They had the freedom to starve in one place. They had the freedom to be beaten half to death by the local police.
That isn't true, you know. I gather you think it's true because I'm sure you wouldn't say it otherwise. But in point of fact, it isn't true, you know. The only people who were beaten up by the Batista police were people who wanted to replace him. He was a despot. I don't deny this. But I'm simply saying that since most people do not want to replace the government, and since in point of fact it was the middle class who led the movement against Batista, not the lower class, in point of fact, therefore, the lower class enjoyed a great many freedoms which were tangible things to them, which they're not nowadays allowed to enjoy. And for you to goblinize the whole era of the 50s as a period during which the poor people just simply had half a banana a day and spent the rest of the time in prison, it's just plain inaccurate. It's melodrama of the kind that makes it much easier for you to justify, again, the Mailer expiation. You're having subscribed to a committee which was bankrolled by Castro himself, it turns out, called the Fair Play for Castro Committee. It's these myopias of yours that make you less than a reliable witness. You're a wonderful writer, but a terrible witness.
Well, are you done? The point that I get back to is why I think Castro's a great man. Great men are great men because they have the imagination to seize a moment in their history and embody it and move a country from one condition to another. It's then left for the likes of you and me to debate the points of whether the country's been improved or has not improved. I could answer everything you've said by saying there's an extraordinary spirit in Cuba today. There's an atmosphere of hope that from many of the things I've heard.
Nazi Germany, too.
Well, we could get into that, too, if we had time. Sometimes a country can feel great hope and not be moving in a good direction, be moving in a hideous direction. Sometimes a country can be moving in a hideous direction and feel great hope because the entire world is obscene.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I mean, the world is heading toward an abyss.
I think
and any orgy of killing releases releases positive emotions because people feel animal again and alive, whereas modern technological society is destroying them. But all I'm getting is these are enormous points. But the one point I do want to make is that Castro had the ability to fight the 20th century, and that's why I admire him profoundly. When he landed in Cuba to take to try to take Cuba away from Batista, he landed with 80 men. 68 of them were killed in the first couple of days. They were without food for 5 days, wandering at night. At a certain point on the 5th day, he turned to the other people and he said, "The days of the dictatorship are numbered." And the man who reported this said, "I thought our leader was mad." Well, of course, he was mad unless he succeeded. You see, many a man says something like that on such an occasion. He succeeded, which meant that he had, the man has a greatness which nobody on the right wing has ever been willing to allow him. By the same token, de Gaulle has a greatness. De Gaulle had the ability to see that the only way France was going to be able to...
Do you know why I disagree with you? For this very reason, that expeditions of this kind are not uncommon in this century or in others. And I join with you in admiring the quality of the stubborn idealism of the people who join in these expeditions. But in point of fact, it's not, as a general rule, they who make them successful. It's historical and accidental events that decide whether or not Castro is going to descend from the Sierra Maestra. For instance, if it had been that a particular sharpshooter had actually sighted Castro.
They didn't.
But the fact that it was pure accident.
I don't believe it was pure accident.
It was an accident that John Kennedy was shot and Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't by the assassin who killed Cermak instead.
Well, of course we get into that.
This does make Oswald a man of history in the sense in which you're talking about it.
Well, then we don't know that Oswald did the killing altogether, do we?
I do.
Well, see, I don't. Every time you speak or I speak, we open a can of beans.
Yeah.
The floor is littered with beans by now.
Would you mind answering this gentleman's question? Because excuse me.
Yes.
Mr. Mailer, I'd just like to know what happened. When I read your work, The Armies of the Night, when it was published in Harper's, you were so much more aggressive. I mean, you said what you wanted, and, that was it. Here, I seem to think that you're circling around. You're going around everything.
And fractious.
Fractious? What is fractious?
And fractious. That's what Dwight McDonald said about it.
I can only say that I was doing my best and speaking as quickly as I could, trying to get as much in as I could. If you think I didn't do well, I'm dashed. I hope there are millions who disagree with you.
Yes.
Mr. Mailer, you were talking before. This on? No. You were talking before about your belief in a soul and your belief in losing and gaining a soul. Yet you also have this feeling, this existential philosophy which you have. And the two seem very contradictory, the belief in a soul and a God, I would believe, and an existentialism, which would be atheistic. They seem to contradict.
No.
Yeah. Kierkegaard was an existentialist.
Sartre is the leading existential atheist. But I'm not an atheist at all. There's nothing about existentialism that lends itself to atheism. In fact, it's rather difficult philosophically to be an existentialist and an atheist, because the first notion of existentialism is that the very feel of the existence that surrounds you at any given moment has enormous meaning. There's a particularly very crude way of putting it. But
yeah, but it has meaning to you, not to a higher
Well, but
thing.
what I'm getting at is from that point, it's easier to move philosophically to the idea of at least a God, and probably a God and a devil, and of forces about one, rather than to believe just that one's own concrete body and there's no meaning beyond oneself.
Thank you.
And there was one more question, I think. Yes, sir. You need the mic. Hand it back, would you?
Mr. Mailer, you spoke earlier at the same time you were talking about Castro, about de Gaulle, and called him something to the effect of the most remarkable demi-conservative in the world today. Do you find that, are you basing that judgment upon the way he's sustained his regime in the context of the events of the past few days? And if so, how do you rationalize that with the fact that his regime even allowed this a general strike which encompassed 10 million people to take place within his country?
Well, a man can, I can say a man is the greatest, I think is the greatest representative of his political philosophy. That doesn't mean he's going to be completely successful. In fact, he may even create a disaster eventually. Castro could fall, de Gaulle could fall. What I admire de Gaulle for is I think at a certain point he had a profound comprehension of the French character, if you will. And I think what he felt was that France was going to perish from within. It was just going to dissipate itself if it tried to enter the European community of nations as one other nation. In other words, it would end up being the least important nation. And what he saw was that France had to become the power again in Europe, because Frenchmen just couldn't take themselves seriously unless they were at least the most important nation in Europe. And so he set out to do that, and he made a whole series of very bold strokes, which also consisted of breaking up a great many alliances with America and England, which was a very risky thing for him to do. In other words, he was a bold man. He was very bold. He was bold the way Churchill was bold, took bold steps. The mark of a good conservative to me always is that they're bold.
Well, come on. Why is that the mark of a good conservative?
Well, because conservatism, since it does hold to so many fixed positions, you see, is always in danger of dying of not obesity, but that thing where you have too much water and edema. I think edema is the natural disease of the conservative. And so there's a certain boldness. In fact, the conservative modes of life, after all, most conservatives are horse jumpers.
Well, in that parallel sense, what would be the mark of a good liberal?
There are times when I say there's no such thing as a good liberal.
Stolidity?
Well, I can't talk about liberals because I think they're the agents of the technological society all over the world.
Good night. Thank you.